We're continuing in our series of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and we've hit week 20, believe it or not. And some of you are like, yeah, I do believe it. It just seems like no. We started, I think, in January, and then we've had some breaks from it. And so we're getting near the end here. And sort of a recap, last week, I had so many notes and so many things to say about 2nd Thessalonians chapter 3, verses 6 through 12. We kind of broke it into 2 weeks. And so last week, we sort of laid down some of the groundwork, because it's this passage where Paul talks about he's working there. And so we worked through it's okay to support pastors. That's not a bad thing. And then Paul actually had some support from Philippi. And they really kind of laid down the idea that there is work. I think a lot of times when we think of work, we think of as a bad thing. We're like, pre-fall, we just sat in the garden and ate fruit off of trees like it was a tropical island. That's everyone's dream, right, in some ways. But really, work came before the fall, and God put the man in the garden to tend the garden. And so work is not bad. It just gets really hard after the fall. And Christians, we should find value and honor in work and working well. There's a tension, though, because you can go, okay, I'm going to work well, I'm going to work hard for the Lord. And then if we don't watch it, though, our heart drifts. And it's easy to love money. The root of all kinds of evil is from the love of money, not money. And so I know we've talked about that. So that's sort of the recap of last week, talking about the place of work and the place of money. And so we begin in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 6 again. It says, "And now, dear brothers and sisters, we give you this command in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Stay away from all believers who live idle lives and don't follow the tradition they received from us." So stay away from believers who live idle lives. So do moochers have cooties? Apparently the answer is yes. No. Is it something you'll catch like the flu or COVID or, something like that? But he says stay away from, and I think the Greek has more of a sense of, pull back from. I think sometimes we think of it as, we have to completely shun people. But if people aren't living the life they're supposed to live, you could still say hi to them. We're not Amish. We're not shunning people. And maybe some of you are from an Amish background. You want to go shun people. I don't know. But there's a pull back from. You can't have fellowship and connection with people at the same level. And I think in this case, Paul's also really talking about pulling back support from. Because, if someone's not willing to work, there's a withdrawal. And I think in our culture, at least, I think we were talking about sayings that are probably going to die with the next generation. So if you don't know this one, I just want to, if you're younger, I kind of want a hand, because I'm thinking we're going to lose some expressions with the younger generation. I'll use sayings and expressions at home, and my kids have no idea what they are, and I'm like, really? I heard that so much growing up. But, birds of a feather flock together. Any of the young people not hear it? Give me a little. You ever heard that one? Okay, they're not willing to say anything to me. But it's like you hang out with certain people that are like you, or often it's said, in our culture, there's a thing, if you have or haven't heard it, you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. Don't know if that's true or not, but there's something to be said from that because, and I don't know if it's prescriptive or descriptive. It's like who you're spending time with. It really does affect you. There's also been said, show me your friends and I'll show you your future. And so there's some sense of who we hang out with, who we spend time with can affect us. And I think that's some of what Paul's saying here. And he says in 1 Corinthians 15:33, bad company corrupts good character. Many of us have that friend, that we would sometimes do things with and be encouraged to do things and get in a little bit of trouble with. Anyone have that friend? If you don't have that friend, you may be that friend. Or maybe you're just better than the rest of us. But, it's easy to kind of get pulled into some things with certain things. I have friends from, I'm not going to name them because it's a small community still. And, people are like, oh, I know that guy. He fixed my roof the other day. Hebrews 10:24 says, let us consider how we may spur one another on towards love and good deeds. The idea is church community, Christian community should be a community that helps spur one another on, that we're supposed to go push each other to do good. And so sometimes you do, it sounds bad. Again, we're not Amish shunning, but you have to pull back from influences that aren't good, and you have to sometimes let them, rest in their own stuff. So we often talk about Matthew 18 here. It tells us how do we handle conflicts with others, but it also gives us really a look at how we relate to someone who won't listen to truth. And so Matthew 18, starting in verse 15, says, if your brother or sister sins, go point out their fault just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over. But if they will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. And sometimes it's loving to withdraw full fellowship and connection for people. And there's an effect on their other lives is, sickness, not wholeness. And there's this, there's good and bad growth. And it's kind of a lot like the flu. Anyone ever get the flu? I mean, anyone like getting the flu? I had a friend who lost a bunch of weight on the flu, and then he's now he's thinner. So maybe the flu was good for him, but most of us, we don't like getting. And if you knew, COVID was funny because, Americans, you've never had people who are like, it's my God-given right to lick doorknobs until, their rejection of COVID, this stuff, and oh my gosh. But, most of us, if we knew, if we licked the doorknob, or, if you knew there was you have a friend who's drinking a soda and they're or even your spouse, and it's they have the flu, you're not going to drink the soda after them, right? Because you're no, thank you, I don't want the flu. Or if it had if you knew the cup had a flesh-eating amoeba on it, you're gonna be careful. And I'm not saying people who aren't living right are like flesh-eating amoebas, but there is a sense in that you have to draw back a little bit because we get influenced by them. And sometimes people have to live in the toughness of their decisions so they make good decisions. It doesn't mean we cut everyone off. Again, Amish shunning. But and then how do we treat a pagan or a tax collector? I think a lot of people read that as this negative sense, like we should shun them and do. No, you call them to repentance. You call them to do right. And so there's times in a body of Christ, and I'm not going to point out people, but I got a list. I'm kidding. There's times when even in a church fellowship, there's people who aren't living in a certain way, and you have to pull a little back from them. Not that you don't love them, not that you don't serve them, but their influence can be such that you have to pull back a little bit. And I think that's what Paul's talking about here. And if you skip down a few verses, because really I know we kind of spent the topics last week sort of covered that middle part there. And so 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 10 says, even while we were with you, we gave you this command, those unwilling to work will not get to eat. And here's the thing, sometimes people have to be uncomfortable to be motivated to do right. And, not willing to work, there's a big difference between idleness and people are struggling. I think sometimes if you're a conservative, sometimes you can kind of focus on that a little too much. And God cares for the poor. And really, again, you have to have this big picture of what God believes or God wants. And God cares for the poor. We have this responsibility to help those who are in need. And that's, if you read the Old Testament, you read the Hebrew Bible, there's all these provisions in it if you're careful in your reading. You have to leave the gleanings. Anybody remember that? I remember my grandmother talked about people still did that. Like you were allowed to pick the first few rows, or at least she did. I don't know if she was allowed, she grew up in a different time. But you were allowed to kind of the first couple rows were for the poor. So you could do something about, there was a way to eat. And if you read the book of Ruth and Gleanings, and you weren't allowed to charge interest on loans. Whereas in our society we charge really, really high interest on loans, but that's another thing for another time. But you couldn't keep their coat overnight because of the debt, because they needed it to stay warm. And so there's all these provisions if you read the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and the point of view can really be summed up in this: Proverbs 14:31. Those who oppress the poor insult their maker, but helping the poor honors him. God has this heart for the poor because God has a heart for all of us, and how we treat the poor really reveals something about us and where our heart is. And so there's that. Now, then we're going to read in James chapter 2, though, it's verse 14 says, what good is it, dear brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith but don't show it by your actions? Can that kind of faith save anyone? Suppose you see your brother or sister who has no food or clothing, and you say, goodbye and have a good day, stay warm and eat well, and then you don't give that person any food or clothing. What good does that do? And it's funny because people I've told you, theologians, they like to kind of go, oh, well, Paul talks about all grace, and James tends to be like grace, and there's grace, but there's works. And I'm like, of course, because anything that produces true faith in you will change the way you live and act. And you can't love somebody and not help them eat. Now, if there was somebody here who couldn't eat today, and I'm not going to make you raise your hand for that, but if there was someone here who literally could not get food, I would hope that any of us who knew that would buy him a sandwich. I'm not saying you have to give them a full-time job. I'm not saying you got to drop them $100,000 or something, or maybe the $100,000 candy bar. I don't know. But hopefully you would feed them in some capacity. And it's kind of like if you have kids. Anyone? Kids, you have family, you have, you're little, like when your kids are little, I mean, they're always hungry when they're little. Sometimes you're like, you're not hungry now. You literally, my kids would be like, I remember my son ate dinner one time, and then he goes over to my grandmother, or my mom's house, and he's like, oh, I heard you guys didn't eat dinner. I'm like, do you remember the pizza we just ate? I'm not saying like kids who, because they're a lot like me. They like to eat. but it's not that. But with kids, if they're hungry, you'd feed them. Now it may be, McDonald's or Taco Bell, although they're getting expensive, right? Oh my gosh, it might be Dollar Tree. Not fancy dinner, but you're not going to let people starve. You're not going to let your own kids starve. And so there is a sense of, we shouldn't let people starve. And that's generally, we want to care for people. We care for our family. And if we care for our family, we care for God's family. And so there is an obligation, especially those who are in the church, to feed, to care, to make sure people have resources, especially when most of us have more than we need. Most of us have eaten more yesterday than we needed. I'm just saying, there's a lot of chili that happened yesterday. But Matthew 25 says this, starting in verse 34, and we've talked about this at length recently. It says, then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you fed me. I was thirsty, and you gave me a drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me into your home. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you cared for me. I was in prison, and you visited me. All good things, right? And they're like, hey, the righteous ones will reply, Lord, when did we ever see you hungry or feed you or thirsty or give you something to drink, or a stranger and show you hospitality, or naked and give you clothing? When did we ever see you sick or in prison and visit you? And the king will say, I tell you the truth, when you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you were doing it to me. And so there is this obligation for us. And so I think some people can take this, those unwilling to work will not eat, as an excuse not to help other people. But that's not often, it's a complicated issue why we have poverty and things in the world. And I'm not going to work out, our political philosophies and policies here. We'll do that in the political philosophies and policies group that meets on the 8th day of the week. No, no, we can talk about those in person. But there's how we help long term with these issues is complex and nuanced. There's a book called When Helping Hurts. And it argues that well-intentioned efforts to help the poor often can be counterproductive. And if you've worked at all, and I've worked for a lot of years with a lot of nonprofits who try to help people, and there's good and bad ways we help people, and it gets complicated. And poverty is a really complex issue. Broken relationships with God, self, others, there's all these things, and sometimes just political circumstances. And modern aid often creates dependency. And so there's a really, it's hard, it's complex. But again, if we're believers and followers of Christ, I think we need to be involved in it because God cares for the poor. And so do we. At Deepwater, I think it's funny because we have we seem to have a heightened sense of this just because of the journeys of a lot of us of faith and where we've been. And it's like, I remember, I think I've told you this story before, but I was with a guy who, he was telling this story about, he had this huge ministry in LA that's well known, and he was trying to get this one guy to come, and he couldn't get the guy to come. And finally, this intern, literally, she's like, well, the Greek says compel. So she drug the dude to the, and it was like, well, exegetically, you might be correct, but think that's a felony. But she got the dude there and everything, and he was like kind of excited, like, okay, now this is going to change this guy's life. And he kind of took part in all the stuff, but it never really changed him. And he kind of felt like the guy was at some point, taking advantage of the programs and the things he had there. And if you've ever worked in that capacity, anyone ever feel that way? Like when you're helping people and you're just, oh my gosh. And he really felt like God saying to him, he's like, if you're going to be a bridge to me, sometimes people are going to walk all over you. Now, I'm not saying that's like our theology for everything, but there's some truth to that. And, here's the thing. As a church, we're doing this big thing, this big toy thing. Like, we do a big Christmas toy thing. If you don't know, we need volunteers. It's going to be in December. But we just have a ton of toys. We buy in bulk, and we just kind of bless the community. We're going to do that. And honestly, there's times where you might get taken advantage of. We might get taken advantage of, but we're still going to do it. Like, we do what we can to limit things, but sometimes sure. We have a food bank weekly. And there's times where, I'll be honest, I'm like, I don't know about that. I don't know how, because there's some struggles sometimes. And I've been in a situation where I was fairly confident that the people I was helping were wasting and squandering their resources, and I was giving them food. But I've seen the kids. The kids needed to eat. So yeah, maybe the parents weren't doing what they need to do, but kids still deserve to eat. Those who are unwilling to work will not eat, but their kids should still eat. And their kids should have gifts under the Christmas tree. And so the truth is, we're going to do some things, and sometimes we're going to get walked on. So, just because it says those not willing to work will not eat, we're not trying to encourage that. We're not trying to encourage that lifestyle, but especially those outside of the church, we want them to come to faith in Christ, but we also want to make sure their kids eat. We want to make sure that there's not starving children. So, but here's the thing, our obligation to help doesn't extend to those, to supporting those who don't need it. Now, this is like a complicated issue in our society, and I am not calling anyone out in particular, because I don't know all y'all's situations, but I've known able-bodied 20-year-olds who live in a basement calling mom to see what's going to be for dinner. Now, it's okay if you're 20-something living in a basement. I'm not anti-living with your family. Like, most other cultures, they live there for, with their families a long time. When I was in Ethiopia the first time, they were asking me, they're like, do you live with your family? And they were kind of testing me, and they were waiting for the American response, which is, no, of course I don't. I don't live with my parents. But I was like, I don't live with them, but I live next door to them. They're like, okay, we'll accept you. Because, it's okay to have other people in the house. It's okay to support your kids. But if you're supporting it and enabling, there's a fine line there, right? And so, if you're a 20-something and listening to this later, get a job. You shouldn't be a 20-year-old living in the basement playing video games all day. There are circumstances, I get it. But in general, get a job, go to school, volunteer, at least do the housework for your mom. But here's the thing. As a parent, I know my kids are at that age where, they're going to school and everything. We're trying to help them. But I could do things to enable them that would cause them to never want to leave. Sometimes you have to make them a little uncomfortable. I'm not saying kick them out in the street, but I don't know. That's a long, complicated thing. John 13:34, I occasionally, quote this. It talks about loving one another. They will know you're my disciples by their love for one another. Here's the thing. Sometimes loving someone is saying hard things and setting boundaries. We often think of love as lovey-dovey, and it's like you love your spouse, that's all good thing. But when you love somebody, you have hard conversations sometimes, ones you don't want. And sometimes we have to have hard conversations if people are not willing to work. For some of us, that seems like almost like we grew up in a culture where, I grew up working all the time. I grew up volunteering all the time, doing all the time. It seemed odd to me and alien that we would not work. But for some people, that is an issue. We'd all like to win the lottery, right? Deep inside, who here has fantasized about winning the lottery and not having to, okay, one of you has it. That's great. You are more godly than the rest of us. I would probably still work, though. I would just make it, more comfortable. Although I would get someone else to do the gutters because, man, they terrify me when I go up there. I am scared of heights. It's not so much the height. It's the rapid descent. And I don't bounce like I used to. And here's the thing. I've fallen off many a ladder. Not just a ladder. I'm dumb. Like I've told you, like sometimes I'll go outside. No, I need to reach something. And instead of getting the ladder, I'll take an old deer stand that's laying around the side of the house and throw it up and lean it up against something and crawl. And then I remember I fell off one time. There was a big loud crash. And Josh was getting ready for school. He comes out. He's like, "Are you okay?" I'm like, "Yeah." I was like, I couldn't move any because it was like I was still that paralysis you have after you fall. No. Yeah, and I've got a scar from that one. But certainly I would change some things about my life if I had money. But hopefully you wouldn't, I think we're still made to work. We're still made to do something. And, we're made to live this life of service and doing. And some of us, this is alien concept to us, but maybe it's, how do we enable that in others? If it's our issue. And so verse 11 says, "We hear that some of you are living idle lives, refusing to work and meddling in other people's business." I like we're reading the New Living Translation because I like that translation. But the NIV says, "They are not busy, they are busybodies." And that pun is in the original Greek, which is fun because it's dad joke justification. There are a lot of puns in the New Testament and the Old Testament. Can I get an amen from all the guys over 40 who do the dad jokes? I think they're funny. But here's the thing: they're not just not working. They're using their time to disturb and distract others, right? And it's kind of like at work. Has anyone been at work and you have that person who doesn't do their job? Some of you are, they're like, "Oh, definitely." You ever had that person at work that doesn't do their job, but somehow keeps you from doing yours too? Like they're sitting there talking to you while you're trying to work, and you're just like, "Oh my gosh, will you stop it?" I'm the one going to end up getting in trouble, and that's kind of what we're picturing here. Although it's not at work, they're distracting. Their busybodies are getting everybody's business, and it's kind of that's the Christians, believers, should be an example of how to work. I read this story, and we actually ended up talking about it in men's group on Saturday. There was this story of and they didn't give me the actual person's name or anything. I would have included it. It was kind of a cool story. They were talking about this business person who they had people who typed in the company. They're typists. I don't know exactly what typists do, but they were typing. It was probably before computers. And they just noticed this one woman was really diligent at her job, and he said something, and the other's like, "Oh, she's a Christian." She's just like, and he said, "Oh, that's interesting." And then he actually becomes a Christian through that witness, it just kind of intrigued him, captures, he becomes a believer. And so he's speaking at a church, and he's, talking about something, and he's telling that story, and this person's like, "Oh, wow." And someone in the congregation becomes a Christian, a follower of Jesus because of that witness, and that person becomes a famous theologian. They didn't tell me his name, I can't tell you, but, it's interesting because then that person then serves the church. Theologians do a lot of work to kind of help us understand the text and the modern times and everything. And it's interesting because just because some person was diligent in typing, which may not even seem like an important job, if you're just kind of doing your job. And a lot of us, our jobs are just kind of things we often. Anyone struggle to see the eternal significance in their job? Probably most of us. Hopefully I'm not raising my hand, right? Hopefully there's some eternal significance in the man, it was, I don't know about that sermon last week. It was no eternal significance. No, but it's easy for some of us to kind of see it, or you might even see eternal significance in parenting because you're like, "Oh, I'm passing on faith to my kids." But sometimes your job is just doing your job. I told you, I cleaned the Bowers firehouse for so many years, for so long. And it was like the bingo nights, and they had the markers that bled through, and I'd scrub the tables and everything and clean it up. And then the next week I'd come in, it was a mess. And I don't know. Maybe it made an eternal, difference. Maybe it didn't. I don't know. But, how I worked and my work ethic was certainly a witness to others. And it wasn't until years later I found out other people didn't have a work ethic. And so, how we work as believers, as followers of Jesus, that is a witness to the world about something. And so your job may not seem significant, but how we do it could matter. It could have that kind of effect on people. We never know the results that we may have from just doing our job, but Christians should be known as people who work well. If you don't busy yourself with work, you'll probably busy yourself with something else, which may not be good. There are some people with too much time on the internet. You ever know that guy? That girl? Internet trolls? Like, there's some people, and I have some friends, like normal godly people that have just spent way too much time on the internet, and now they're like a conspiracy theorist, and I'm like, you need to focus your mind a little bit. It kind of makes you wonder, it's like the people here, because remember in Thessalonians we have all this trouble with people kind of spreading rumors, saying false things, all these things. Are these the people? Like, is it the people who just kind of, they're not working, not doing, they start, because you'll fill your time with all kinds of stuff. And if you have a ton of extra time, I'd like you to clean the gutters, fix. No, there's things you could do. And there's ways we can impact people with our free time. And it's okay to relax too. But it's okay to, focus on yourself. And that's, when we get off focus and we're not doing anything with our time, often we end up doing the wrong things. Verse 12 says, we command such people and urge them in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ to settle down and to work and earn their own living. NIV says to do their work quietly. ESV, settle down. In other words, get a job. Sometimes there's a temptation to think we have to do great things. And we were talking about, again, men's Bible study is sort of my proving ground for thoughts. I'm like, what do you think of this? What do you think of that? And, we throw it out in men's group, and they tell me, that's a terrible idea. And then I include it in the message anyway. No, but sometimes we have to do great things. And I think, especially as in the church in the 90s, it's like you're preaching to young people, you kind of want to do like awesome things for God. And, that's awesome. And I do believe some people are called to do awesome things for God. But there is also beauty in this simple, quiet life, honoring God. And I remember I did a funeral a while back, and I was talking to the person, and they're almost like apologetic, because some older people of an older generation that are passing away now, they just kind of lived a good life. That they did their thing, they had a family, they had a few little hobbies and stuff, but they just lived their life. And it's almost like you want them to have done something great or changed lives. But I think there's something beautiful about just a simple, quiet life. You enjoy your family, you enjoy your friends, you do your job, and it's okay to do big, great, important things too. But for a lot of us, it's just going to be this simple call to live a good life, raise godly kids, do godly things. And so, there's beauty in this simple, quiet, God-honoring life, and that kind of a life is a witness to the faith. And there are times we may not want to do the work in front of us. Anyone else struggle to get up and cut the grass sometimes? You're just like, oh my gosh, I cut it last week. Pre-tornado, we only had to cut ours. Well, some years we didn't even get to cutting it because we had trees, and it was like, no one's coming over, I'm not going to weed whack. And I really could do my whole yard with a weed whacker. And my dad would cut the front part when he was cutting the Christmas trees. There was like 2 little strips of grass in my whole yard. And it was like, but now it's like I have to cut it every week. It's like, it's ridiculous, right? Like, it just grows all the time. And, but I get up sometimes, I'm like, I don't want to cut the grass. But you do it anyway, right? But there's something about it when you're done. It's probably mostly men who cut grass, but women, if you do this too, there's something kind of like, when you're done, do you kind of go, look at that, right? Like, you're like, it looks great. I hated cutting it, but it looks good afterwards. And you feel good about it. And that's really, sometimes work is not always fun. But you have to learn to look at it afterwards. You might not be excited to start, but look at the satisfaction of getting a job well done. It doesn't mean you like every part of your job. Again, I've had lots of bad jobs. I have lots of things. I hate weeding. But you know what I do? I have to go weed. There's certain things you may not like doing, but still you can have satisfaction in that job well done. And diligence in our daily lives ultimately will bring satisfaction. I like the way the Message translates Romans 12:1, and it says, so here's what I want you to do, God helping you. Take your everyday, ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going to work, and walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. Our giving our lives daily to God will change the way we work, will change the way we interact with people, it's a testimony to who he is. Now, it's a longer quote, but hopefully you like this. This a theologian said this. He said, there's a difference between leisure and laziness. Because it's okay to have leisure and have time off. Like we can kind of get so busy, and I tend to do that. I struggle to take time off. My wife has to make me take time off because I'm always like, there's something I could be doing. Anyone like that? Don't raise your hand. We all know it. Some people want more leisure than they have, but some of us struggle to rest. So there's a difference between leisure and laziness. Relaxation and recreation provide necessary, much-needed balance to our lives. When it's time to work, however, Christians should jump right in, making the most of their talent and time, doing all they can do to provide for themselves and their dependents. Rest when you should be resting, and work when you should be working. So there really is that balance. Now, likely, most of us aren't trying to get someone to pay all our bills, right? Anyone trying? Maybe you are. I don't know. Maybe again, I like many people, I fantasize about winning the lottery. But apparently, there's this thing where you have to buy a ticket. And I don't buy tickets because I think it's a tax on people with poor math skills. I might fantasize about winning the lottery so I don't have to do some of the hard things. But not working might seem odd to many if you grew up with like work ethic as a value. But some people will struggle with this. And Christians should be blessings, not burdens. We must be careful in how we live our lives. And so some of us, maybe you're like, oh yeah, I can't people don't work. Time theft at work? Anyone ever, go on Facebook at work? We do things, and I've seen all kinds of statistics about how much, you're at work, but we're not working, right? And so even as a believer and a follower of Jesus, how I work matters. Too much dreaming and not enough doing. Some of us talk a lot about work, but actually doing work, you might work next to that person. Even parenting. Are we inadvertently teaching our kids to be lazy by doing too much for them? And it's like, I've told you many stories. I made my kids stack wood and carry wood since they were very little, and we had a saying was no heat for you. If they didn't bring in firewood, I close the door at night and they get cold. Now they're older, they've learned to work, so it's, I don't have to do that to them. And I wouldn't really let them freeze, but, the point was they have to learn to work, but to learn to contribute. And so the worship team comes back to play. As a church, we're always going to struggle and walk that fine line between helping and enabling. I remember we used to have a clothing closet, and I'll never forget, it helped a lot of people when we were downtown. And I remember this guy coming in, and he was getting clothes, and he took off the stuff he had, and he put on new clothes, threw out the old ones, and walked out. And I thought, man, we may be, one, that was awkward and weird, but two, we've probably gone too far in helping. Like we've crossed that line into enabling, and when you can't wash things. But I don't know, I can't remember if I washed those clothes after that and just kept them. But I think we're always going to help people, but we have to try to limit being taken advantage of too. And but we'll always choose to have a heart of God, have the heart of God to the poor. You can't become hardened and callous to the people who do struggle. And as followers of Jesus, again, we want to be a blessing, not a burden. We work diligently and faithfully, and that's a witness to the gospel. And you may never know the effect it has on someone now or in the future.